welcome to Stanley Reads. My name is Kimberly Datchuk, and I'm the Curator of Learning and Engagement at the Stanley Museum of Art. Today, we're going to talk about 3 chapters in Homegoing by Yagyasi, Quey, Ness, and James. I'll relate them to some works from our collection and give a little bit of history about the works and the time period discussed in the book. I'll start with Quey. We have a date to anchor this chapter as 1799, and it takes place mostly in Afia's village. And here's to kind of orient us to what we're looking at and the region that we're going to be diving into. In the upper right corner, you have a map of Africa, and we see Ghana on the western coast, sort of at the midpoint of the continent. And in the larger map, you have the full map of Ghana. This is around 1700 when this map was made. And in the circled area, you see Cape Coast. That is the city where Quey was born and where he was raised until he was almost 14, and then he went to school in England. And when we open this chapter, he's just returned and he's working on bookkeeping. And he had been working in Cape Coast Castle, and he has just been requested to go to Afia's village. And he's in that village, but we don't yet know what were the reasons that he ended up there. That's revealed towards the end of the chapter when he's talking to his uncle Fifi. And that brings us to this object here. This is an Asante-style figure. Now, with Q and his family, we're talking about Fante lands, but remember the Asante and the Fante are both together the Akan peoples, and there are similarities between the two cultures, which is why I brought in this work. This object shows a mother who is nursing her child. The dark wood can make it difficult to see in the image, but here's the child on her lap who's nursing. We see on her feet that she is wearing sandals. That can be an indication that she is the queen mother or has a royal status. This kind of object would have probably been found in a family shrine, and it would have celebrated the matrilineal lineage. We learn at the end of this chapter the importance of matrilineal lineage to the Fantes, and particularly to Fifi and Q. Q asks Fifi the question, "Why do you keep calling me son?" It's especially confusing to Q because he has hardly been to this village. He visited when he was in utero with his mother Afia, when Kabi, his grandfather, was dying. And this time, when he's about 20, is the first time that he's been back, and really the first time he's actually been there to experience being in the village, meeting his other relatives, ever. So he's really confused by this really familiar and close relationship that Fifi uses when he's talking about him and referring to him as son. Fifi explains that power is placed and passed down through the mother's line. And so because Fifi and his sister share the same mother, his sister's son, his nephew, would have closer blood to the matrilineal line than his own child, who has a mother from another mother. That's kind of a confusing way to think of all of that. And it's even more confusing because in Homegoing, we learn that Afia and Fifi have different mothers. They share the same father, Kobe, and on Kobe's deathbed is when Fifi reveals to Afia that Baba, who Afia had been raised by and who thought was her mother, is really not her mother. Fifi goes into the complex family relationships and the impact and the trauma that it's had on him. He explains that he's hated Afia, that he loved her like a sister when he was little. Their mother's contempt towards Afia shaped the way that he felt toward her as an adult. And he feels shame for that, and he continues to feel conflicted. He doesn't quite know how to feel about Afia. Still, he feels as though he needs to make something right. Kabi had promised Afia that her bloodline would be joined with Abiku's, who was the chief in their village, at some point. The idea was that Afia would marry Abiku and be his first wife. that didn't work out because of Baba's machinations behind the scenes. But this is a way that Fifi sees to set things right. He is going to make Quey marry the Asante princess that he has kidnapped and who has been the source of desire because of the power that she holds. So Nana Ya is now in the village. She was kidnapped by Fifi, and she is destined to marry Quey, and in doing so, fulfill the promise that Kabi had made Afia. And so we see kind of the significance of the matrilineal line and power within this Asante figure. I'm skipping Ness for now and sticking with James because that will keep us in Ghana. And we're also going to continue to explore the importance of family lineage and representations of power. With James, we're around 1820, and we're in Afia's village again in Fanteland, and he travels with Quey and his mother, Nana Ya, to Kumasi, where his grandfather, Nana Ya's father, is being buried. Again, to kind of orient us, here's the map of Ghana, and the lower, in the southern area, Cape Coast is near Afia's village. Kumasi is north, and we learn that it takes about 30 days for them to travel there. Osei-Banu is the king, the Asante king, and he has been killed by the British. It's not explicitly stated, but it's heavily implied that that's what happened as retribution for his warriors killing the British governor. As they travel to Kumasi, we kind of learn about the difficult relationship that Quey and Nana Ya have. Nana Ya doesn't really respect Quey or think he's a strong person. James is sort of stuck in the middle of all of this. One key component of this chapter is the funeral. During the procession is when James, everything starts to shift for him, right? A key object that is mentioned is the Asantehene, which is the king's stool. And here we have an example of a king's stool. We know that it's for a king or for a royal person because of the shape it takes, and also because of these metal, these bronze pieces that are inlaid into the wood. That would only be on a stool of a royal person. When a king dies, that stool becomes a home for his soul. The soul inhabits that stool. The stool itself gets blackened, and it is laid on its side in a room, and it is a point of contact for the ancestors. So nobody else after that person has died will be sitting in the stool. Power, responsibility, family ties wrap through the chapters on Q and James, and we see a lot of decisions being made, sacrifices being made by both Q and James, and Nana Ya, for that matter, that play out in the rest of the story. And here you can see some of those details a little bit better. There's detailed carving here on the side where these pieces are joined, and you've got the metal. You can see the metal details more. We're going to skip now to Ness. So Ness is Essie's daughter, and we learn that Essie in the plantation that she's placed at is called Frowny because she never smiles. And to sort of give us a location to figure out where we are, this is what the United States looked like around 1804 to 1806, which is probably the time period that we're thinking about in this chapter. With Ness, we don't have any specific dates, except for one. We know that she was sold from the plantation where she lived with her mother to another one in 1796. And she thinks that was about 10 years ago. She's not really sure. She doesn't have a clear way to track time. And in some cases, it's, doesn't really matter how long ago it was. The significant part is that it happened. And we find that she's traveled through a few different plantations, one that she calls Hell, and we don't really know where that is, but we do know that she had lived in Jackson, Mississippi with her mother, which is around this place where the star is, and Tuscumbia, which is now Alabama, and that's in the northwest corner of Alabama. So just to kind of locate us and think about where we might be. I think we should note that Mississippi, where these two locations are, and probably where all of the plantations that Ness lived and worked on at the time of her life, they're all in Mississippi territory. And Mississippi is not a state yet. That is a key fact and something that might be viewed as sort of a throwaway line in the chapter, but one that I think is incredibly significant. The devil who owns hell, the plantation in hell, makes a statement that he wants his slaves paired up and married. And he says it's his insurance policy. Insurance against what? One interpretation might be that if people are paired up and start families, they're less likely to leave the plantation. They're less likely to risk it and run away. Another way to look at it is something that is tied, I think, to what Charles White is exploring in this Wanted poster series, which is there is always the insurance of having more people to sell. If people are paired up, they're more likely to have children, and those children can then be sold. At this time in the United States, the slave trade had been outlawed. It was becoming harder to get enslaved peoples from Africa to the United States. It still happened, but it wasn't legal. Therefore, the wealthy plantation owners who had lots of slaves, people like Thomas Jefferson, were selling their slaves to people in the Western territories, places like Mississippi. And that's how they were making additional money. So even if they had a bad year for their crops, they could still bring in money by selling other people. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit so we can see it more clearly. Within this, we have two individuals. There's a boy on the left, and he's sort of looking up. And then there's a woman on the right side, and her gaze is more level, slightly looking down. We get the sense that they're probably related. This is probably a mother and son. We see them, the circles that encompass their portraits are very close to each other, but separated. There's a line going down the middle of this print that keeps them apart. It also speaks to the separation of families within that, by their portraits being similar and close, but not quite together. There are 2 years in the upper left and upper right side of this print. On the upper left side, 1619, that's the year that the slave trade began. And on the right side, we have 19 and 2 question marks. And we get the sense that these are supposed to be 2 bookends, the beginning and the end. And yet there is no date for the end. The question is, when will the ramifications of slavery actually end, right? We're still feeling them today. Surrounding these 2 portraits are these gestural shapes. They kind of feel like brushstrokes, but they're more solid than that. They're kind of rectilinear, and they have some power, but they sort of erase everything around them. So it seems like there's very little that these 2 individuals can hold on to. There's very little certainty around them. The last thing that I want to talk about in this is the X. And that I think could have a number of significances. One that I find tied to the story and tied to this chapter of Ness is when we look at her name, the power of naming her came from the owners of the plantation, not from her mother. Her mother had named her a Twi name in her own language, and her mother was beaten for that. Ness got her name as Ness because during that beating, her mother, Essie, yelled out her first English phrase that she's ever just said spontaneously, "Oh my goodness." It was something that the cook would say and kind of use it as punctuation to her sentences. She would start her sentences with, "Oh my goodness." So it was a phrase that Essie would have heard a lot. Um, but the fact that it came out spontaneously during this beating, Essie thinks that it has a divine meaning or a divine message, that it was meant to be. So she starts calling her daughter Goodness, which gets shortened to Ness. So we have a woman whose name originates from a beating and from a language that her mother does not speak. When we look at the family tree at the very beginning of Homegoing, we see that Ness's name is Ness Stockham. Stockham is the name of the plantation that she's on when this chapter starts. And because that's her last name, we get the sense that it's the plantation that she dies on. We're not sure when that happens. At the end of the chapter, she's waiting for the ramifications for her punishment for protecting Pinky. And so we don't know what the end result of that beating is going to be, what her punishment is going to be. But yet we see her entire identity is captured and tied up in her existence as an enslaved person. It's not her own name that her mother chose. It's not, nothing about that, about her, how she's called, has anything to do with the choice on her part or the part of her family's. That is significant. And that is something that I think Charles White is exploring, one of the many things that he's exploring in this print. Thank you for taking the time to look through the collection with me and think about some of the themes in these chapters of Homegoing. It's a difficult book to read, and there are some definitely challenging aspects of these chapters. Thank you for sharing with me and thinking through these. I'll see you next time.